In 1961, a UN convention listed cannabis as a Schedule I drug, ranking it among some of the most addictive and lethal drugs in the world. Despite this, a bohemian-style anti-war and anti-government youth movement that is strongly associated with cannabis and psychoactive drug usage known as the hippie movement thrived. This movement was a serious threat to the ongoing war in Vietnam, a war that then-President Richard Nixon very much intended to resume. In 1971, President Nixon declared drug abuse as public enemy number 1, and this led to the disastrous global war on drugs. In the previous year, Nixon set up the Shafer Commission to advise on what action to take regarding the criminalisation of marijuana. To his surprise, Shafer's verdict was that the Commission is of unanimous opinion that marijuana use is not such a grave problem that individuals who smoke marijuana should be subject to criminal procedures.
We do not feel that private use or private possession in one's own home should have the stigma of criminalisation, that people who experiment should not be criminalized for that particular behavior.
But Nixon simply ignored the Shafer Commission and signed laws criminalizing marijuana use anyway, and this essentially outlawed the hippie movement. Holland, Netherlands, the Dutch, or whatever you prefer to call them, took a very different approach compared to the US. The Dutch have long been a quiet leader of tolerance amongst Western nations. There's a strong cultural value of allowing others to live as they choose, so long as they don't interfere with society as a whole. In addition to being tolerant of soft drugs and prostitution, they gave voting rights to women and persons of color way back in 1919, and also pioneered gay marriage rights as early as 2001. But contrary to what the movies have told us, cannabis and psychoactive drugs are in fact illegal in the Netherlands. The Dutch state didn't want to legalize it partly due to pushback from foreign allies. In the 1970s, there was an alarming problem regarding the use of cannabis, speed, heroin, LSD, and other recreational drugs in the Netherlands. The then Minister of Health and Environment, Irene Vorink, examined the medical and social harm caused by various substances. Vorink noted that young people often experiment with tobacco, sex, alcohol, and other drugs as a natural part of their development. She concluded that cannabis was considerably less harmful than the other drugs, and that young people are most commonly introduced to harder drugs directly through the drug suppliers themselves. To her, cannabis is not a gateway drug. The suppliers are. Vorink reasoned that the criminalization of cannabis makes it more difficult for authorities to reduce harm to young people, and recommended the use of youth centers as places to permit the sales of small amounts of cannabis in order to avoid interactions with more dangerous drug dealers. Another plus for decriminalizing cannabis is that it meant that authorities can focus their attention on enforcing laws for more lethal drugs like heroin and cocaine. The youth centers selling cannabis eventually evolved into coffee shops, spelt as one word. The Bulldog became the first coffee shop established in Amsterdam in 1975. So in 1976, the Dutch government signed the Opium Act. This act formally separated soft drugs and hard drugs and officially identified cannabis as a soft drug. The act affirms that cannabis is illegal, but that it would be tolerated under certain restrictions. Coffee shops are prohibited from advertising, possessing or selling hard drugs or alcohol, causing a nuisance, allowing minors to enter the premises or selling soft drugs to them, selling more than 5 grams of cannabis in a transaction, having more than 500 grams in stock, and selling soft drugs to non-residents. These conditions, however, are enforced to varying degrees depending on the municipality. The restriction against selling cannabis to non-residents, for example, is only enforced in a few locations on the border. Since coffee shops are not allowed to stock more than 500 grams of cannabis, suppliers will often make multiple deliveries a day in order to meet demand. This leads us to an ongoing contradiction regarding Dutch law enforcement of cannabis. A coffee shop is allowed to buy and sell cannabis within the legally tolerated limits, but suppliers are not allowed to grow, import, or even sell cannabis to coffee shops. This means that the front door is open, but the back door is illegal. A summit in 2008, attended by 33 Dutch mayors, largely agreed that regulation of the back door is favourable, and some mayors started issuing special licenses for the production of cannabis. In 2017, a law was passed that partly legalized the production of cannabis. Coffee shops in certain cities can now legally acquire cannabis from state-appointed producers. The personal use of hallucinogenic mushrooms is tolerated in the Netherlands, but the sale of most of these were made forbidden in 2008. Although the use of these drugs are generally safe compared to other drugs, their effects are also difficult to predict. Calls for a re-evaluation of the drug grew substantially after a 17-year-old French girl jumped from a building after eating psychedelic mushrooms during a school trip to Amsterdam. Despite this, the sale of less potent psychoactive truffles are still available in smart shops around the country. The Dutch also put a strong focus on drug education and harm reduction. The intention of their drug policy is to normalize drug problems, reintegrate abusers into normal life, and avoid the stigmatization, marginalization, and isolation of offenders. To the Dutch, drug abusers are not so much considered as criminals as they are considered as normal people that need help. Addiction care falls under everyone's health insurance policy in the Netherlands. If one needs help getting rid of any addiction, the cost will be fully reimbursed by Dutch health insurers. Barriers for receiving treatment are intentionally made low with minimal paperwork and requirements. Addiction treatment has also been integrated into general medical practice in order to remove the need for specialists. The Amsterdam Municipal Health Service now operates a network of over 200 general practitioners who can prescribe methadone for addicts. Methadone is an opioid that is used to curb the symptoms of opioid withdrawal, but without causing the highs associated with dangerous drug use. This ensures that users are able to obtain high-quality opioids in a safe environment. As a result, drug abusers are less inclined to commit heinous crimes in order to fund their addictions and are able to focus on rebuilding their lives. The service also makes the illicit opioid market far less profitable. The only requirement to receiving the methadone is that it be consumed on premises at the clinic. The Dutch were also among the first to institute syringe exchange programs, where drug users could trade in old hypodermic syringes for new sterile syringes. Increasing the supply of sterile syringes reduces needle sharing and thus slows the transmission of HIV. According to a report by the European Monitoring Centre for Drugs and Drug Addiction, the Netherlands had the 5th lowest high-risk opioid usage of all the participating countries. The UK, for example, has more than 5 times the number reported by the Netherlands. The same report shows the age distributions of drug-induced deaths in participating nations, and the numbers reveal that the Netherlands is the 4th best when protecting its youth from drug-induced deaths. Reading further, we can see that the Dutch are also able to boast that the number of HIV diagnoses related to drug injections was only 0.1 per million, a number that is 17 times less than Germany, 23 times less than Sweden, and 99 times less than Greece. Another report by the National Institute of Health compared cannabis usage amongst young people in the US, Canada, and the Netherlands. The report found no differences amongst boys and found that usage amongst Dutch girls were actually less than in the other 2 countries. The US spends $47 billion per year on drug prohibition, while the Dutch spend roughly $2.6 billion per year. Per capita, that equates to roughly $142 for the US and $155 for the Dutch. So per person, the Dutch drug policy is a bit more expensive. But as we saw previously, in the Netherlands, less people are using dangerous drugs, less young people are dying from them, almost no HIV transmission is occurring through needle sharing, and cannabis usage is roughly the same. But there's also the high cost to society that we need to account for as well. Where the US spends billions of dollars suppressing drug users and criminals, the Dutch spend the money on rehabilitation and harm reduction. If there's anything that we can learn from US drug policy, it's that the suppression of drug usage has only necessitated far more heinous and vile crimes. When drugs are made illegal, a lot of people don't stop using drugs, and the people who continue to deal drugs are unable to elicit help from the police or the courts, so deals and contracts are resolved with violence and murder instead. A direct comparison by Nation Master shows the following results. According to these results, the murder rate in the US is 5 times higher than in the Netherlands, the rape rate is 3 times higher, and the police officer count is 270 times higher. The US has 5% of the world's population, but has 25% of the world's prison population. The war on drugs has also created a market for huge criminal enterprises like the cartel to thrive. And it's also been a huge part of the destabilization of Central and Southern American countries. People die in Mexico because of drug-related violence at a faster rate than they did in the wars of Afghanistan and Iraq combined. The price of the lives lost through drug-related violence, the destabilization of nations, and the incarceration of non-violent drug abusers is simply tragic. The war on drugs quashed the hippie movement in the 60s, a movement made up mostly of university students. What are the chances that those hippies grew up resentful of the government and became the professors that instigated the spread of the socialist ideologies that are causing the most threatening cultural divide in America today? The US government, the legacy media, and big tech recently came together to silence, condemn, and persecute the Capitol Hill riots and the movements that led up to it. But there are people with legitimate concerns which have not been addressed and in many cases outright dismissed. Those people haven't disappeared, and like the disenfranchised hippies of the 60s, those people will find a way to fight back. The more you suppress people, the harder they push back. The more you try to control something, the worse it becomes. Hey guys, thanks for watching. YouTube probably won't like the way that I ended this video, but it's the only way for me to illustrate that the struggle that we're seeing today isn't about left versus right. Both sides are being suppressed at some point. The real struggle is the government and the big institutions teaming up against the people. Anyway, if you like the content, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and leave a comment too, it really helps. Thanks guys.